Officially, we welcome everyone to today's session. My name is Solimar Salas, Vice President of Museum Content and Programming at the Museum of Latin American Art. We welcome you today, Wednesday, June 23rd, to this edition of MOLAA Zoom Project in conversation with artist Harry Gamboa Jr., where MOLAA Chief Curator Gabriela Urtiaga will discuss the artist, his work, and career. This session is directly sponsored by Lamont James Nash. MOLAA also acknowledges the support of the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, the Kenneth T. and Eileen L. Norris Foundation, the Arts Council for Long Beach and Southern California Edison for their constant support of the educational program at the Museum of Latin American Art. In each chapter, in conversation with the artist and our MOLAA Chief Curator, we place the focus on a series of specific artworks which require a close inspection and deliberate process of contemplation and exploration, delving into the ideas surrounding the creation of the works, their sources of research and inspiration, in an effort to immerse ourselves in the world of the artists. In Chapter 11 of MOLAA Zoom Project, we interview the renowned artist Harry Gamboa Jr., who lives and works in LA, Los Angeles, California. Harry Gamboa Jr. is an artist, author, and educator. He is the founder and director of the international performance troupe Virtual Vérité from 2005 to 2017. He's also a co-founder of Asco, ASCO, from 1972 to 1985, the Los Angeles-based performance group. He is co-director of the Photo and Media program at the California Institute of the Arts. His work has been exhibited and collected nationally and internationally in the following institutions: Ludwig Museum in Cologne, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, California, Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, Centre des Arts Plastiques Contemporain in Bordeaux, France, the Appel, Amsterdam, Nottingham Contemporary in Nottingham, England, Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., Tate Liverpool in Liverpool, England, Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, Los Angeles County Museum of Art in Los Angeles, California, Centre Pompidou in Paris, France, Statens Museum for Kunst in Copenhagen, Denmark. He is also the author of Soloitskuintli, Doppelganger, and Other Stories. His recent essays have appeared in Polity of Literature from Amsterdam, Verfail Numbers 10 in Hamburg, and Exploring Communism, A New Aesthetics of the Real from Antwerp. He is the author of Urban Exile, Collected Writings of Harry Gamboa Jr., edited by John A. Noriega from the University of Minnesota Press. With this, we give an official welcome to all of you for being here with us, and our most highly honored moment for the artist to be here with us and during this interview. And I leave you with Gabriela Urtiaga and Harry Gamboa Jr. for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Solimar, and all the MOLAA team. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to MOLAA. I hope you are well and safe, and thank you for joining us today. Hello, Harry. Good to see you.
Yeah, hi, Gabriela. Thanks for inviting me, and happy to be with MOLAA here today and everyone.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's a real honor to have you with us today, Harry.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I've been doing this for quite a while. I think next year will make it 50 years that I've been taking photographs. So I guess it's been kind of a long journey.
Yeah, for sure. And we are excited to hear about you. And Harry, you have been involved in creating visual and performance work that interpret the contemporary urban Chicano culture in LA. And one of the ideas behind your body of work was breaking a stereotype, right? And I would like if you can tell us your beginnings as an artist, as a young person from East LA, growing up in a complex context.
Yeah, so I was recently commissioned to write an essay slash short story based on my early childhood and how I arrived at some strategies on how to overcome some of the hardships that were imposed on the Mexican American community by the establishment, actually. And so I grew up in the 1950s under the Eisenhower era. And of course, Eisenhower had been a general in World War II, but he was heading up the government in the 1950s. And the first thing he did was establish something known as Operation Wetback, which then criminalized any Mexican walking down the street, which of course has continued to this very day. And if I really recommend everyone looking at the BBC today and viewing the conditions of children in the camps, even under this administration. So my situation at a very early age growing up in Boyle Heights was that I was condemned on my first day of school for speaking Spanish. I was physically oppressed. It was sort of a very common feature to harm children if they were resistant to assimilation. One of the things that I was involved in early on, and at this point, excuse me for a second, was that I decided that school was not exactly my forte. I would probably be better off if I was involved in self-education. And very early on, I found myself always involved in reading, writing, expressing myself visually. This, of course, was not welcomed in the system. It became even more so when I was a teen and I became involved in the Chicano movement, but it became very urgent to really speak out. I grew up during the era of the Vietnam War, when many of my friends never made it past the age of 17 or 18 because they were drafted. And so I found myself really actively engaged, and as a result of that, came to the attention of the President Richard Nixon, who was a protege of Eisenhower, who had a very specific antipathy towards Mexican Americans also. And so at a very early age, I found myself in the role of define and redefining Mexican American culture so that we might be understood as actually being Americans, and also to not in any way be required to forego our heritage. And so this was in an era when mass media would portray Mexican Americans in a very negative, derogatory light. The newspapers, the television shows, the movies would constantly portray Mexican Americans as either being downtrodden, being uneducated, being uncreative, being untrustworthy, which of course was an absolute falsehood. It was designed specifically to generate animosity against the people, but most likely to ensure that the population would not grow economically, politically, and educationally. And of course, that was such an obvious point that I found myself, and I continue to promote positivity through education, through creativity, through personal actions, and to also to embrace the world, as it were, and to reach out internationally at a very early age to share what we have to offer, because the mass media would generally block such information. So it required sort of different approaches, and so something like this today could only have been imagined back then. Yeah. And I'm very happy to be here.
For sure, Harry. And in that context, how did you discover the way to express your feelings and questions through your art making?
Well, I think one of the things that I grew up in was in the particular population I grew up in East LA and Boyle Heights in the 50s and the 60s was a result of the migration from El Paso, Texas during the 40s. And they had experienced, back then when I was a teenager, for instance, if you talk to me, I will talk about Asco today, but Asco happened 50 years ago. When I was a teenager, I would talk to people who were currently at my age then, but they had experienced the Mexican Revolution. They had experienced World War I, World War II. And so I had many, many mentors that talked about war, but also the strategies to arrive at peace, also strategies on how to utilize media and again, this would be prior to the use of computers, how to reach out to people and to, in a way, influence and also to counter-influence. Again, using different methodologies. And actually my entire purpose has always been to draw people to the present as opposed to being in the past. And of course I cannot foresee the future, but I'm usually very clear of what's going on in the present, which of course then serves as the next step for anyone who's paying attention, how we can approach what comes next.
Yeah, and could you share with us your inspiration when you co-found the avant-garde Asco group in the 70s, which was an act of resistance, right? Yes. Because Asco group appeared at the beginning of the Chicano movement and in the middle of a powerful historical environment.
Right, so I actually was handed a magazine titled Regeneración, which was based on the publication by Ricardo Flores Magón, a very famous, philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century. And she handed me the magazine in the middle of the tear gas lobbies that were being tossed at us in the middle of Laguna Park in East LA during the moratorium. I then went on and became the editor of this magazine, and I had taken a look at it and realized that what it needed was art. And I had met Willie Heron and Patsy Valdez when we were young teenagers, and I had heard of Grunk and sought him out. And I had invited also Mundo Mesa to participate in the publication, as did Carlos Almaraz also. And so at a very early point, we worked together as sort of designing this magazine, but it was during this process that I also purchased a 35 millimeter camera and realized I had a capacity to capture images in a manner that kind of expressed what I thought might be a good idea. I actually went out and invited a handful of people to also become members of the group, one being Lorraine Ordaz and a few other artists. As it turns out, the artists that accepted initially were Willie and Grunk, and then followed later by Patsy. And so, and also Humberto Sandoval, who appeared in many of the works for many years. Putting this group together was very interesting because, of course, the other artists were painters and they would draw. And so during the Asco era, the majority of the work that was being produced was actually graphic and in paintings and the developing of murals. And of course, Willie and Grunk became very well-known muralists in the early 70s. And of course, Patsy and Grunk went on to have long painting careers. But I was always working. I always had some kind of blue-collar job. I mean, I did many jobs. I was a city bus driver. I worked in different institutions. I did a lot of things, but most of this was to fund my projects and to actually purchase the hardware that's required to capture cinematic quality of photography. And my background had been primarily as a cinephile, and I was very interested in creating images that in some way could have long-lasting impact and some that could cross over. And I felt one of my ideas was, of course, when you present a film, any kind of feature film is presented at 24 frames a second. You see a million frames at the end of the movie, but nothing moves, except when you walk away from the movie theater, you only really remember one frame. And I realized that if I can photograph that one frame and forego the rest of the movie, I might be able to produce many movies or no movies on a single roll of film, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, well, Harry,
Which you will
for
see
sure.
some today.
Yes, and for that, I would like to put the focus in one of the most symbolic and dramatic photography that you produced during 1974, the Koigan War victim from the Asco era, a political, critical image with a lot of meaning, right? Will you tell us about your message in this particular and moving piece?
Okay, so one of the things about Asco was, it was very infrequent when we actually did these kind of cinematic film photographic productions, again, because I was generally always working. And so I would be able to make sure that everyone got together, and I would usually figure out a location that was symbolic to the neighborhood. So this actual street was just down the block from the Chicano Moratorium, and many people had been gunned down in this street as a result of the militarized police that were just shooting randomly at families during that day. And but in this time period, the newspapers, the local major newspapers, were competing, and they decided, as a way of selling newspapers, was to promote the idea that East LA was nothing but a gangland area, which of course was not true whatsoever. But the newspapers back then, if you could come across some of these publications, you'll realize that if there was an incident, they would always list the possible perpetrator, where their families lived, where their families worked, where the sister went to school, and of course, basically provide a roadmap for retribution. And the next week, somebody who had been listed in that newspaper was now on the cover of the following newspaper because they had been harmed. And then you had also people such as right-wing commentators on some of the local TV shows that picked up on this kind of idea of promoting the idea of this kind of violence as having been the primary events in East LA, which again was false. And it started making money for people. And of course, this would then lead into a whole prosperous film kind of thing that was taking place in Hollywood. And I decided that it would be kind of interesting to generate an image. And so for this, I gathered some road flares. I set up some a red lamp utilizing what used to previously be used to illuminate streets, which was mercury vapor lamps, which I think gave off some kind of deadly wavelengths. So it kind of looks very eerie, and had Grunk lay on the floor on the street, but I portrayed him as being the last gang member to ever be killed in East LA. And the following, when I had this image process, I made numerous copies of the 35mm slide. I then got dressed up in a suit with a briefcase and delivered it to many television stations, and they actually broadcast it as being the last gang member to be killed. And I think it was in a exhibition called Global Conceptualism at Queen's Museum, listed this as one of the top conceptual performances of the 20th century. And this piece, of course, is in the collection of both MOCA and the Whitney. But it's been exhibited throughout the world, and of course appeared on the cover of Art Forum.
Yeah, it's amazing, Harry. And for example, I really know that the city of Los Angeles, the community and friends were so important for the group, right? And we are looking at X Party from 1982.
Right.
And with your art, you are interested in transforming any event in a performance, playing with the techniques and themes of Hollywood cinema, for example. What was your formula in this work? And if you can tell us about the concept of no movies.
So this particular piece, and it has two very important people in here. So this has Therese Covarrubias and Daniel Villarreal. Therese, of course, was the lead singer for the band called The Brat, the East LA punk group. And Daniel Villarreal would, in the future, become quite famous for a character he portrayed in a movie called American Me as Little Puppet. And here they're both very young, of course, but I created a whole series of photonovelas utilizing 35mm slides with an accompanying audio track. And I would, for a couple of years, I I did many of these photonovellas that were sort of sequential images that would kind of tell a tale, a very absurd tale, but and kind of hinting at what's going on in the interiors of the homes throughout Boyle Heights, except that I would unannounced exhibit them on the exterior of homes in various neighborhoods. I would project them and use loudspeakers, and everyone would get kind of a glimpse into what was going on behind closed doors. And this, of course, always talked about the complexity of the kinds of lifestyles which involved manias, phobias, but also high intellectualism and poetry and the kinds of things. And of course, sexualized behavior and also political subversion. And at the same time, ideas that kind of push everyone forward. So here we had people that were addicted to all kinds of pop culture materials, and yet were poverty stricken, and at the same time enjoyed the various conditions that come from understanding all of Einstein's theories of relativity. So here the balloon represented the universe under their control.
Oh, yes. And Harry, after a period of work, you continue creating a body of pieces with your friends and another artist, and you create a particular series of pictures like a photonovelas that you mentioned. And it will be fantastic if you can introduce us to the different appropriation that you are talking about. And we can see here Parking Lot from 2002 with Jeffrey Rangel and Luis Vega as a performers.
Right. So I would say that in the 90s, my shift kind of turned to sort of what they refer to as human intellectual capital of the Chicano environment. And I found many people who, I had been introduced to a different population in the 60s and 70s. But by the time of the 90s, of course, these were the people that were infants at that time. And yet these were the people that were classically trained in universities, but still had sort of very unique ideas and activities. So for instance, Jeffrey was a person who interviewed me for the Archives of American Art. And yet he's appeared in some of my work, and Luis Vega is a performer. But I started focusing primarily on the use of public space. It's something I had always done, but I started looking at it a little bit more formally, the control of space, the privatization of space, what's known as public space, what's known as common space, and and sort of the decimation of our ability to utilize public space as a result of policing and surveillance, and the kind of behaviors that would take place. And so I utilized some of the earlier techniques of making sure that things would take place instantly. So here, this was part of for many years, I would always throw parties in parking lots. And so here we had sort of a party, mini riot, friendly gathering. And while everyone's dancing, everyone's exchanging ideas. So as opposed to attending a forum, the exchanges it's very kinetic also, and of course utilizing someone else's property, which is something I've always done. I've never asked permission, and so this piece is sort of and again the idea, the notion is that the images themselves become the art. They're not just the documentation. The events are created to create the art, and so which is that concept, and so again it's sort of a takeoff a little bit and sort of maybe pushing forward on Warhol, and also maybe the utilization of wholly iconographic images, as it were, from a much earlier time and political. How does something that exists in front of you then be captured, then become something that generates interest and becomes something of a motivator, and how to induce action in others.
Yeah. And Harry, another important project in your career is the virtual Vérité era. an international performance group founded in 2005.
Right.
And I would like to know about your creative process during this period and how you connected with other artists to be part of your creation.
Well, again, this kind of became more of a more focused thing. So there was a break in the 90s. A lot of different things came in that kind of interrupted the creative process, real life events that needed to be taken care of. For instance, my wife, Barbara Carrasco, had to overcome certain things, and fortunately, she succeeded in her health problems that then allowed her to continue also. And so maybe in 2005, I had been teaching for many years at this point already, but I had had the opportunity to meet many people who were formally involved in academia. I was more interested in the peripheral elements of academia, and managed to encounter not only really super brilliant colleagues, but super brilliant students and former students. I found myself also traveling throughout Europe and Mexico, of course, and Scandinavia, and locating different individuals. And of course, as a result of teaching in the UC system and lecturing throughout the East Coast and lecturing in Europe and Mexico, I was able to meet different people from different backgrounds from all around the world, including Japan, Korea, Chad, you name it, Uganda, and found myself recruiting people. And the group was kind of, the working title was Virtual Vérité, never really formally that, but I found myself putting these people together. And what it was these are all people that have really high IQs, but at the same time have a very visceral presence in a way. And the idea was to utilize space in groups, small coordinated groups, cadres, I would have to say, this idea of very efficient conceptual groups. And of course, this is a formula that's used throughout the world to undergo military action, to undergo economic action, but I found it also to be useful as art action. And so sometimes I would have these various actions take place simultaneously in various cities across the world, with most being undocumented at all. And the idea was for them to be witnessed and to be spread through verbal interaction, and then occasionally to go to the different locations and have people perform in front of me. And as though they were witnessing, I'm capturing the expressions of witnesses, and also people in a position ready to either fight or flee. And so this is the kind of thing that kind of determined sort of the onset of the 21st century. Of course, the 20th century was all about human angst. But of course, in the 21st century, it's been the actualization of horror, of the kinds of mass destruction, of the kind of mass elimination of human rights. For instance, of what took place yesterday with all 50 Republican senators denying the voting rights of Americans, that being a very anti-American act. This idea of the kinds of things that we only could have imagined taking place are taking place. Okay, and as I mentioned, the idea that and all of this this notion that it's okay to put children in cages, it's okay to put children in prison, it's okay to harm these children, and not by coincidence have the majority of them be Latino, and with absolutely no feedback. And so this is I see it all as a continuum from Operation Wetback to the present. And then, of course, I am completely aghast and against such abuse. And again, as an artist, all I can do is create work. And I do this all peacefully in a way of generating an intellectual, a creative, a cultural response of beauty, and to have everyone understand that the majority of children are going to adapt very well. The majority of children are going to outperform others. This kind of abuse only pushes the surviving members to even become stronger and to generate a culture throughout the future. And I'm sure that by the end of the 21st century, we will see the wealth of culture that has been created by the people who are children today.
Yes, Harry, and we need to work together to do something, right? And your art is amazing, incredible. You create a specific climax around the picture, but also you are an activist. And this is so important in this time to share with our audience, with our community too.
Yeah,
And
so if you don't mind, I could just mention one or two about these two
yes.
prints. So for instance, on the upper right is a piece called Pearls. And this piece somehow took on a life of its own and really wound up being distributed widely all through Washington, D.C. And then the one on the lower right, which is called Six to Tangle, was introduced in a big exhibition and cultural event in Houston, Texas, but wound up being exhibited throughout Texas. And on the upper left, you have people who have been educated at Harvard, at Princeton, at Yale, and you have all these kind of scholars that are presented here, all of them, most of them published, that kind of influence people, not only through their words and actions and their intellectual works, but with their bodies. And so one of the things that, and I taught a course in Antwerp and not too long ago to a group of intellectuals, and it's a whole concept that the body learns first. And the body remembers as well as the mind, but the body reacts first. And so, and that's kind of been at the core of my work since the Asco era also, is like, how do you utilize your body to create an image? And even if in an environment where your body is denied access to be reflected in mainstream media, well, the only way to counteract that is to create your own imagery using your own body.
Of course. And in these particular pieces that we are seeing, what is the importance of these three pictures in the links between bodies, such as hands, right, piers and wires?
Right. So, and this, of course, it's all about, you know, I guess one of the ideas that I've kind of talked about in the past has been how many kind of tools of oppression, you know, the thing is that in most cases with oppression, the key ingredient is fear. So you really only need a few pieces of hardware to control people, but really the overlining kind of information that keeps people in place is fear. But basically almost all structures to confine people are absolutely fragile if people decide to break free. So here you have people held together with a string of pearls, with a rope that's untied. And here you can't even see exactly what's holding these other people together, but you know, they look like they're about to confront a group that's in front of them. And maybe on the lower right, they're witnessing some horrific event. The idea is also the concept that as a small group, you can probably break through anything. And of course, this has been proven throughout history.
Yeah, and Harry, another poetic and magnetic photo is Glide from 2015, picturing what looks like a daydreaming girl wearing a black clothes.
Yeah, so this piece I feel is extremely important. This was taken while I was working on a book titled Lennox, and this was in the neighborhood of Lennox. Lennox is one of the most densely populated areas of unincorporated Los Angeles. It sits jutting up against the two landing strips of LAX. Endlessly planes are landing. But the day I photographed this, the warning was that no planes would be flying, that no one should look towards the Pacific Ocean that day. And what it was a military weapon was being tested. And so it was that day that, and this is Stephanie Guerrero, who was a former student at CalArts and a really fine painter. I had asked her to write a poem on a paper airplane, and her poem is about peace and love. And she personally flew it across all of the 1 square mile of Lennox. And wherever she posed, she had this paper airplane. But in her fashion, I mean, she looked like a Vogue model walking through this neighborhood that has undergone many different types of demographic changes, but she glided across Lenox, and here, kind of in a pop culture donut shop, she's posing, but you know, how do you transform sort of a low income eatery into a fashionable location to pose, which has always been sort of my influence. And again, going back to my early years, I grew up in a neighborhood with people that had been influenced from the Pachuco era, in which fashion was absolutely important, and attitude. And of course, we all spoke Cologne, which is the dialect of resistance that resulted from the Mexican Revolution, and which obviously continues to be necessary even during this era. And so this day, one of the things with Stephanie was also the utterance of maybe one or two phrases in Cologne, as well as this plane that eventually was tossed into the air. That particular evening, very dangerous weapon was fired across the Pacific Ocean, and it was blinding and actually caused damage to people's eyes, even though people were warned not to look at it.
Yeah, and then Harry, we have here two other dynamic pictures that are telling us a story.
Yeah.
Aztlán from 2015 and the Six Expanse from 2016, right?
Right. So on the top, I guess it would have been maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer also, for maybe about a 4 or 5 year period. I worked with Virtual Vérité. I guess it would be in Los Angeles, in Antwerp, in Berlin, East Berlin, Stockholm, Mexico City, to create these photonovelas that would result in print media photonovelas. Francesco Siqueiros, of course, and here we have Alma Rodriguez performing an Aslanx. And the term I put together, which involves Aslan and angst, merge them together. And it's basically the angst, the results of identifying as Chicano. And how do you counteract this? And this whole, and my fotonovelas are always very satirical. It's all about satire and making fun of the economic systems and the valuation of money over human beings, and everyone running usually and avoiding capture, but also recognizing that they too are being subsumed by the capitalist culture, and it's inescapable, and everyone being under view. And what happens when you are under constant surveillance? Do you become a victim, or do you perform for those that are looking at you? And which of course is the option. And so for here we had these different individuals. I must have had maybe 30 people, and actually that particular group for this particular Aslanx, maybe 5 people then went on to get their PhDs within the next few years. So they took moments from their studies at that point. You know, these kind of moments take place in real time on the streets of LA, and then disappear, they dissipate. And so the idea that LA also is like an urban desert where things that take place are pretty much like a mirage. You might witness something, but it's gone and it's replaced with a succeeding action. Very similar to a cut in a film, but it's real life. And so, and with the bottom image, we have Ana Garcia, who also is a graduate from Cal Arts in photography, a very fine photographer, but who I have known since she was quite young. And she had performed in a video that I had done based on a quinceañera where a girl got lost and showed up 10 years late to her own quinceañera. So I had her participate in this piece, which was about the 6th Street Bridge. I found out that the sort of the major iconic bridge of Los Angeles that had been on many, many Hollywood films, such as Point Blank and other films, Them and other kinds of Hollywood films, that this bridge that was the main artery between Boyle Heights and Los Angeles was to be condemned, and that it would be destroyed, and that there was another artist who was receiving a $1 million art project as a result of the restructuring of all of this. And I decided I would make one without any money whatsoever. And what I decided to do, because this bridge, of course, originally was made in the 1930s, it was an asymmetrical bridge to make you feel happy that you were leaving Boyle Heights. Mm-hmm. And when they were started to eliminate this bridge, I decided that I would create a whole body of work under the overarching title called The Sixth Expanse that goes over the LA River. I would photograph people doing things that we would normally do on a bridge or near a bridge: walk, kiss, laugh, fight, argue, crawl, all the kinds of things that maybe I had done on that bridge or whatever, things I'd heard of, people getting lost, twirling. And so as I would go for about a period of 1.5 or 2 years, photographing this bridge, every time I took my performers out to the bridge, there was less and less bridge, and it started being destroyed. And so there's various images of the bridge being removed. Here you could see that the cranes are ready to remove the arches in the background here. Finally, when the LA Times was invited to attend and Carolina Miranda showed up, there was no bridge. It was all over with. But what really the important element was that we had created a community of people who had experienced things. So the article that appeared in the newspaper was the idea of how all these artists had come into interaction to basically form their own various groups and actions and projects, and being very proactive in generating culture. And as opposed to dust being a result of a destroyed bridge, we use it for a regenerative action of creating art and influencing culture.
Yeah, and Harry, you are sharing with us the memoir of the city at the same time, right?
Yeah, right.
And the last selected picture was created during this special time during the pandemic,
Right.
titled Non-Confederate from 2020.
Right.
So important because you are an active and you are active during this a special time recording stories of a lot of life. And of course, I can see it in your Instagram, and you publish a book, Striking Distance, right?
Yes. So Striking Distance actually resulted, I was first given an idea to photograph during the early pandemic as a result of a commission I received from the Autry Museum, in which I photographed street life at the beginning of the onset of the shutdown and the various techniques to stop the spread of the virus. And it was during this period of time and kind of the adjustment to being part of the pandemic. One of the first things, of course, that occurred to me was that my work always really does rely on people's faces and my ability to communicate and all this. And it was kind of this learning process on how to deal with this. And all of a sudden, all my friends are in masks and I don't get to see people and whatever. And so I decided that it would be interesting to photograph, do portraiture of people in masks. And that's what the book is about, of course, striking distance. But in order for me to photograph these people as a portrait, I had to be within reach to either be struck in the face or to be struck by the virus. And so that was sort of the situation. And when I photographed for that particular book, several blocks down the street, the police were beating people up and shooting tear gas at people. And this would have been during the Black Lives Matter events that were taking place last summer. This was taken a little bit further on in October when it became very clear of the right-wing extremism that's taking place across the country, sort of this false hope of the reincarnation of the Confederacy. I felt that it would be kind of an interesting thing to title this No Confederates. And of course, have a Confederate means you have someone associating with you in crime. And these people are not criminals. All three are very well gifted artists and intellectuals, and they're not Confederates, they're individuals. And they are also anti-Confederates. And so this idea is that rather than a mob action, as we saw in the Capitol at the beginning of the year, what we really need is individualized and small group and large group people really promoting peace, promoting our rights as Americans, as world people, and to respect people from around the world, and especially to protect the rights of children and women and everyone. We have to understand that the kind of behavior that's taking place at this point is unacceptable. But again, as being an artist, I'm not a politician, but my idea is that whatever's done is actually done with style.
For sure. Well, Harry, and we really know the power of the art, right? And it's for that it's so important to share your knowledge, your experiences, and to finalize our conversation and open the Q&A session. What is your next project, Harry?
I actually just last Friday gathered a handful of people, some who have been involved since Asco and during virtual Vérité, and I'm kind of gathering a new group and basically working on a new series of portraits. And I've also just recently been asked to write an essay for another European journal. And so I'm trying to kind of put all of these together while, and somehow I'll wind up being the director of the program next year at CalArt. So I'll be very busy during the coming year, but in between the various kinds of projects, it's always also my privilege to support young artists and to really try to help mentor one or two people, but also to serve as an example and to live by example, basically. And so it's been very important to just continue to make work. And so, and I, of course, leave it up to others who are more trained to explain to me what it is that I have just done.
Sounds great, Harry. And well, we are opening the Q&A session. Jorge is the curatorial assistant, and he can read the question from our audience.
Thank you, Jorge.
Everyone. So it's been a great conversation so far. The Q&A session is now open. If you haven't already, please feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the chat. I can get started with a question. Harry, obviously one of the features of our technologically changing landscape is the increased accessibility of photography. How have you seen this transformation shape and affect your own practice from film to digital?
Well, I actually still use film, primarily when I'm shooting my portrait series, Chicano Male Unbonded, and a handful of other projects. But I have shifted over, of course, to digital. And the idea of the digitization also kind of involves quite a bit of responsibility. So you have billions of people shooting billions of photographs every single day. And so then this creates an environment that requires the artist and the photographer and anyone who's a socially interested person to strategize. How are you going to get anyone to look at your work? How are you going to filter through billions and billions of images so that your work is the one that actually gets included in the dialogue and the conversation and moves people to the next stage, whatever that might be. And so, and because there's so many various images appearing, that also means that you cannot rely on a singular image to last forever. So, it kind of prompts you to continue to move and to continue to produce, and which is one of the benefits of working in digital, which allows you to shoot all day if you like. But it's a really good idea to be very astute and thoughtful and to respond to your own creativity and spontaneity.
Yeah.
Let's wait a minute and see if anyone has any questions. Again, feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat. Give it a minute. But if those are all the questions, then
Well, I mean, you know, my question is, why only one question? And again, you know, I'm so used to being a professor, and it's, I think one of the things that really might be an element also of the new media is the reliance on the kind of non-textual responses in a way, and non-verbal, and this has been something that's kind of been introduced to society. So we are kind of image driven in a way. And if so, well then it's a really good idea for everyone to probably think about not only your public persona, but how are you going to interpret things in your life through imagery. But it is very important to engage verbally and textually. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a teacher today, so
we did get a few questions finally. Harry, can you talk about your use of video in the 80s? It seems like you focused on still photographs in series rather than moving/video lately.
So in the 80s, I wound up being introduced to video early in the 80s and had access to something known as public access. In the early 80s, TV cable was actually connected by wires, and it was not over the air. So in other words, every single home that was connected to a cable station was literally wired to that station. And they were under certain legal constraints that they must keep one station open per cable company. And I figured that out early on, and I was able to produce maybe about 100 5-minute videos. And I would make copies of these and literally mail them to various television stations across the country and kept them in rotation. And so many of my early videos were shown to millions of people, particularly here in Southern California, that went all up and down the coast on a company called Falcon Cable that I don't think exists anymore. But these were all very absurdist kind of films. One of them still is available online that you can see. It's called Baby Cake, K-A-K-E. It's sort of as a result of MOCA putting this on. But, and the rest are actually in collected DVDs available through the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA. And, but the videos usually were very absurdist, related primarily to relationships going awry, but then being very dreamlike, kind of driven by the psychosis of the 80s, but also inspired by disco and also inspired by pop culture, and also this idea of understanding that we were in the grips of the atomic age and kind of struggling with modernism and postmodernism. And so in the end, most of these videos were created on sort of self-destructing videotape, which was very much in line with like Mission Impossible. And so most of the things that were created actually vanished and were pre-digitized, which meant they were not this stable. And so they resulted in memory and a few. And one of the works that I did is titled, called LA Familia, which resulted from me videotaping my son Diego and my wife Barbara kind of having a slight argument in the car. It grew into a larger kind of video project, and I brought in Humberto Sandoval, originally from Asco, and it took 1.5 years to create this, and eventually that was screened at the 1995 Whitney Biennial. It was selected and then traveled and exhibited throughout Europe, which then generated an additional film by Ilpo Pohjola in Finland, and we created a film titled Asfalto, based on an opera I had written in the 90s.
Thank you. Rachel asks, how do you see the influences of the Chicano movement evolving today, and how do you see your art reflecting these more predominant issues in the present, such as the crimes being committed by ICE?
Well, again, I believe the last time we had children gathered in camps, probably wore very terrible uniforms of World War II. ICE, of course, I feel needs to be disbanded completely. The idea of privatizing all these constraints has allowed for children to be viewed as being monetized. And of course, it's in complete violation of the United Nations Charter defending children's rights. And so the idea of holding anyone against their will, of course, if one has committed a crime, but actually all of these are subject to more international constraints. And all of this is in, of course, complete violation, particularly under the previous administration, which was then set up from even that previous administration. And so, I mean, it would be, it's the Chicano, the term Chicano, by the way, I identify with the term Chicano. I know there's other terms that have come up, but if there's any time for the term Chicano to be utilized, I believe it would be now, because in that term, it kind of is based on politicization of an individual who understands human rights and is willing to fight for human rights. And of course, being Mexican, Mexican American, you know, for me, it just seems so absurd to expect people to go somewhere else where their ancestors have been here for 40,000 years. You know, you cannot tell someone to go away and it's their home. And so, but of course, we live in a political reality where all of the history of Mexican experience is duly erased and set into some level of amnesia, collective amnesia, and never referenced. I mean, all you've got to do is look at all of the television shows that are on any airwaves, any pop shows. They will never and do not involve Chicanos to engage in the dialogue. If there's any issue related to Mexican Americans, they will ask someone from someone else to tell everyone what we're thinking. And we are a major population, and yet we do not exist in Hollywood. We barely exist in television, and we do barely exist in the English language radio. But internationally, I believe people are paying very close attention to the way we as people either respond or are being treated. And so it's extremely important for everyone to understand that your education, your ability to remain strong and to be creative is absolutely important. And to encourage young people to engage in developing their skills and to become extremely bright and being able to stand and move forward, because this is a very complex era we're living in.
Thank you, Harry. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted their questions.
Yes.
And with that, we'll close the Q&A.
Well,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and thank you so much, Jorge.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you, Harry, for your generosity, for sharing with us your knowledge, your experience, your love for art and the community. You are a real inspiration for all of us, and thank you so much.
Well, and good to see you again, Gabriela.
Okay, hope to see you soon, and thank you all of you, yes, for joining us today. See you in our next Zoom project with the great artist and activist Judy Baca. Bye. Bye-bye, Harry.